Night in a medieval city does not fall all at once. It seeps, it slides slowly down the tiled roofs, gathers in the narrow alleys, and settles in the places where the sun has never truly reached. Even during the brightest days, shadows remain trapped between the stone walls, as if the city itself remembers something it would rather not show. Beneath those streets, beneath the taverns and chapels and courts of law, there is another world, a lower world. It is colder there, quieter, and older than the laws written above it. The stones of the medieval torture chambers were not chosen by chance. They were thick, rough, and heavy, stones that held moisture, stones that did not crack easily, stones that could listen without responding. In the Middle Ages, justice was not abstract. It was physical. It had weight. It had smell. It had sound. If you lived in this world, you would not grow up fearing torture chambers. That fear came later. As a child, you would hear stories, half-whispered, about men who went below and returned changed, about neighbors who disappeared behind locked doors and never returned at all. These stories were never told loudly. Loud stories attracted attention. Attention was dangerous. Most people believed the chambers existed for a reason. Order required fear. Confessions required pressure. Truth, it was said, lived beneath pain. And so the chambers were accepted. Not loved, not praised, but endured as part of life, like famine or plague or war. Until the day they became personal. It rarely began with violence. There were no screaming arrests in the street. No dramatic scenes like those imagined centuries later. Instead, it was almost polite. A knock, a request, an order wrapped in calm words. Two men would stand at the door, not soldiers in shining armor, but officials, servants of the law. Their faces forgettable, their voices neutral. They already knew your name. That alone was enough to drain warmth from the room. You would be told that questions needed answering. Nothing more. No explanation, no accusation, no chance to prepare. You would walk with them through familiar streets, noticing small details that suddenly felt important, the sound of your own footsteps, the flicker of torchlight against stone, the way people avoided your eyes. And then, without ceremony, you would be led to a building you had passed many times before. From the outside, it looked ordinary. Inside, it was not. The door to the lower levels was never wide. It did not invite. It narrowed, forcing bodies to turn sideways, to bow, to submit before even entering. When it closed behind you, it did not slam. It sealed. The sound was soft, final. As you descended the stairs, the air changed. It grew damp. Cold pressed through your clothing. The smell was a mixture of stone, rust, old water, and something else you could not immediately name. Fear does not arrive all at once. It builds. With each step downward, the world you knew receded. The voices from above faded. The light dimmed. Time itself felt slower, heavier, as if the stone resisted movement. At the bottom, there was no welcome, only space. Small chambers lined the corridor, each with iron-bound doors. Some were empty, some were not. From behind one, you might hear breathing. From another, nothing at all. You would be placed in a cell, barely large enough to lie down. The floor was stone. The walls wept moisture. The ceiling pressed low. There was no sense of day or night. And then you would be left alone. This is where most modern minds would already begin to break. Not from pain. Not yet. From waiting. In the medieval torture chamber, time was a weapon. Silence was a tool. Uncertainty was intentional. You were not told when questioning would begin. You were not told what you were accused of, You were not told if there would be mercy. Your thoughts would circle endlessly. Every memory would become suspicious. Every word you had spoken in recent days would replay in your mind, twisted by fear. Above you, life continued. Markets opened, bells rang, people prayed, ate, slept. Below, you existed in suspension. The stone around you had heard countless others breathe the same way. It had absorbed whispers of denial, prayers for forgiveness, promises made to any god that might still be listening. It did not answer. And in that silence you would begin to understand the first reason why you would not survive even a single day in a medieval torture chamber. Because before the body is ever touched, the mind is already being dismantled. Slowly, patiently, without mercy. The law that did not need truth. Above the chambers, the city believed in order. Beneath them, order took a different shape. In the medieval world, law was not built to discover truth as we understand it today. It was built to restore balance, to satisfy authority, to close cases, not to question systems. Guilt was often assumed long before the first question was asked. Confession was not evidence, it was resolution. When you lay on the cold stone floor, listening to water drip somewhere beyond the walls, you were not waiting for a fair hearing. You were waiting to become useful to the process. The people who ran the chambers did not see themselves as cruel. That is important to understand. They were clerks of pain, administrators of suffering. Many believed deeply that they were performing a necessary service. To them, torture was not punishment. It was procedure. Medieval legal doctrine taught that truth, when hidden, resisted gentle methods. If a man denied an accusation, it meant either he was innocent or he was lying. And since innocence could not be proven easily, the system assumed resistance indicated deception. Pain was considered a language the guilty could not lie in. The chamber itself reflected this philosophy. Nothing inside it was accidental. The size of the room, the height of the ceiling, the placement of hooks, beams, ropes, and benches. Even the distance between the door and the center of the floor was measured. Everything served a purpose. You would not be brought directly to the instruments. First, you would be made to see them. A torch would illuminate the shapes slowly, allowing your eyes to adjust. Shadows would stretch unnaturally along the walls, transforming simple objects into looming silhouettes. The executioner, or interrogator, would not rush. He had learned that anticipation weakened resistance far more effectively than force. He would speak calmly. He might even offer water. He would explain that cooperation would shorten the process, that honesty would reduce suffering, that the law required answers and he was merely its voice. Then he would ask the first question. It would not be complex. It would not accuse directly. It would sound almost reasonable. Your answer, whatever it was, would rarely satisfy him. Not because it was wrong, but because the chamber was not designed to accept denial. The system moved in one direction only. Each pause, each hesitation, each attempt to explain would be recorded not as nuance, but as resistance. And resistance justified escalation. This is where modern minds fail to comprehend medieval justice. We assume that innocence protects us, that logic matters, that explanation leads to understanding. In the torture chamber, explanation was irrelevant. What mattered was alignment with the expected narrative. The interrogator already had a version of events: names, places, motives. Your role in that story was not flexible. The chamber existed to make you accept it. And so the questions would continue. Slowly, relentlessly, not shouted, not screamed, spoken in steady tones, repeated again and again, wearing down your sense of time and self. You would begin to doubt your own memory. Did you say that? Did you know him? Were you there? Under pressure, the mind does not cling to truth. It clings to escape. And escape in the chamber had only one form: agreement. This is the second reason you would not survive a single day. Because the medieval torture chamber was not trying to extract facts. It was trying to rewrite you, your name, your story, your past, until what remained matched what the law required. Outside, scribes prepared parchment. Seals were warmed over candles. Paperwork waited patiently. Inside, a human being slowly dissolved into a statement. And the stone walls listened, as they always had. Without judgment, without memory, without mercy. Instruments that were never meant to kill. The instruments waited long before you ever arrived. They were not hidden away like shameful secrets. They were not improvised in moments of rage. They were crafted deliberately, maintained carefully, and displayed openly within the chambers. Each one had a name, each one had a history, and most importantly, each one had a purpose that stopped short of death. This is where many modern imaginations fail. We picture medieval torture as wild brutality, as uncontrollable violence, but the chambers were built on restraint. Killing the accused too quickly was considered a failure. A dead body could not confess. A corpse could not name accomplices. A broken man, still breathing, could. The rack stood at the center of many chambers, not because it was the most violent, but because it was efficient. A wooden frame, ropes wound tightly around rollers, pegs smoothed by years of use. Nothing decorative, nothing excessive. When a body was placed upon it, there was a precise method. Wrists secured, ankles bound, tension applied slowly, almost respectfully. The interrogator watched not the face, but the joints. He listened not for screams, but for sounds deeper and more final. The first stretch caused pain, the second caused panic, the third rewrote anatomy. Ligaments tore quietly, muscles elongated beyond their nature, shoulders slipped from sockets with a dull, intimate sound. The body did not explode in agony immediately. It protested first. Then it betrayed itself. And still, the rack was considered merciful, because it could be stopped. Other instruments offered less forgiveness. The strappado required height and gravity, a rope, a pulley, hands bound behind the back. The body lifted, then dropped just enough to tear without breaking. Again and again. Between drops, questions were asked calmly, as if nothing extraordinary was happening. The interrogator knew how far to go. He had learned through apprenticeship, through observation, through tradition passed down like any other craft. There were manuals, though rarely written. Knowledge lived in practice, not books. Pain was measured, not in screams, but in endurance. Iron collars weighted in corners, heavy and cold. Spiked devices designed not to pierce deeply, but to press, to remind, to humiliate. They forced the body into unnatural stillness, each breath becoming an exercise in suffering. Thumbscrews sat small and unassuming on tables. They required no strength, only patience. Turn by turn, bone resisted, then surrendered. What mattered most was that none of these instruments killed quickly. They left marks that healed poorly. They created damage that lingered. Survivors carried pain for life, if they carried life at all, and that was intentional. The medieval system believed that punishment should echo beyond the chamber. A broken gate, a twisted shoulder, a hand that never fully closed again. These were reminders to others. This is the third reason you would not survive a single day. Because the chamber was not chaotic violence. It was controlled dismantling. Your body would not be destroyed at once. It would be unmade gradually, piece by piece, while your mind tried desperately to keep up. And as the instruments did their work, something else happened. Time stopped behaving normally. Minutes stretched into hours. Hours collapsed into moments. The flicker of torchlight became the only measure of existence. Hunger, thirst, exhaustion blurred together, until all sensation fused into a single awareness of pain. And yet, the interrogator remained calm. He adjusted ropes. He wiped sweat from his hands. He paused to let damage settle. He asked questions again, softly, patiently, as if offering you a chance to end your own suffering. At some point, truth ceased to matter to you. Only relief mattered. And relief came at a price. Agreement. Confession. A signature you could not read. A statement that would follow you long after the chamber released you. If it ever did. The men who asked the questions, the men who questioned you, did not look like monsters. This is another truth that unsettles the modern mind. They were not drenched in blood. They did not snarl or shout. They did not rage or lose control. Most wore plain robes, dark wool, sometimes leather softened by age. Their hands were clean when they entered the chamber. They spoke quietly. Some spoke kindly. Many believed, sincerely, that what they were doing was necessary. Interrogators were chosen not for cruelty, but for discipline. An unrestrained man was dangerous. He might go too far. He might ruin a body too quickly. He might let anger interfere with procedure. That was unacceptable. The ideal interrogator was calm, methodical, almost gentle. He understood anatomy not as a healer did, but as a mechanic understands a machine. He knew where pain traveled, how it multiplied, how fear could be guided like a current. He had learned this over years. Often he began as an assistant. He carried buckets. He held ropes. He watched faces change. He listened to sounds he would never forget. Over time, he learned when to stop, when to wait, when to ask again. He learned that pain alone was not enough. Fear was the real instrument. Before any device touched your body, the interrogator spoke. He explained calmly what would happen next. He described the instruments without embellishment. He made no threats. He offered no promises. He let your imagination do the work. This was deliberate. The mind often broke before the body did. Interrogators understood that uncertainty weakened resistance faster than agony. Not knowing what came next made each moment heavier than the last. Silence between questions was as effective as force. Sometimes they left the room, not for hours, not for days, for minutes. But those minutes stretched endlessly. Bound, exposed, listening to distant footsteps and dripping water, you were left alone with anticipation. Your thoughts spiraled. Your courage thinned. By the time the door opened again, something inside you had already shifted. And when the interrogator returned, he asked the same question. Not louder, not harsher, exactly the same. He waited. If you answered incorrectly, he nodded, almost apologetically, and signaled for the instrument to be adjusted. This rhythm repeated. Pain, pause, question, silence. Over time, your sense of truth dissolved. You stopped thinking about what was real. You thought only about what would make it end. Confession became a survival strategy. It did not matter if the confession was accurate. What mattered was that it satisfied the process. Names were offered, Stories were invented. Guilt became flexible, shaped by desperation. The interrogator recorded everything carefully. Words spoken under agony were treated as sacred testimony. The system did not acknowledge coercion. If you spoke, it was assumed you spoke freely. And once written, your words could not be taken back. This is the fourth reason you would not survive. Because even if your body endured, your mind would betray you. Modern people imagine themselves as rational, informed, resilient. But resilience depends on context. It depends on rest, nutrition, safety, and the belief that suffering has limits. In the chamber, there were no limits. There was only procedure. And procedure did not care who you truly were. Only what you said. Only what could be written. Only what could be used. The waiting that came after the pain. What most people misunderstand is that the chamber itself was not always the worst part. The worst part often came after. When the instruments were loosened, when the ropes were untied, when your body collapsed back into its own weight, there was no relief in the way the modern mind expects it. Pain did not disappear. It rearranged itself. It settled into joints, into breath, into memory. You were not healed. You were processed. Guards lifted you not with care, but with efficiency. They had done this many times. They knew where to grip without reopening wounds. They knew how to move a body that could no longer cooperate. You were taken from the chamber into holding spaces that were colder, darker, and quieter. These rooms were not designed for punishment, but for waiting. And waiting in the medieval world was its own sentence. The cell was small. Stone absorbed sound. Moisture clung to the walls. Straw on the floor had been used by others before you, and would be used again. It carried smells that told stories without words. Here, time lost meaning entirely. There were no clocks, no windows, no certainty of day or night. Only the rhythm of guards passing, the distant clang of iron doors, the echo of footsteps that might stop outside your cell, or might pass by without pause. Your body attempted to understand what had happened. Pain flared unpredictably. A shoulder burned when you breathed too deeply. Fingers throbbed with each pulse of blood. Muscles locked into spasms without warning. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by jolts of sensation that dragged you back into awareness. And always the mind returned to the same question. Will they come back? In this place, uncertainty was constant. You did not know if your confession had been sufficient. You did not know if your answers had satisfied anyone. You did not know if silence now counted as resistance. You listened. Every sound became significant. Every pause carried weight. You learned the difference between footsteps that belonged to guards and those that belonged to interrogators. You learned to count heartbeats between distant noises. You learned to measure hope in seconds. Some prisoners prayed, others cursed. Some rehearsed their confessions again and again, refining them in their minds, preparing for another round. Others abandoned thought altogether, sinking into a dull acceptance that numbed the edges of fear. But the body never forgot. Wounds swelled. Infections crept silently into torn flesh. Fever came without warning. There were no physicians assigned to heal you fully. Care was minimal, practical, just enough to keep you alive if further questioning was required. Survival was conditional. And even those who were released did not truly leave the chamber behind. When a prisoner was deemed finished, they were escorted out through corridors they had never seen before. Daylight struck the eyes like a blow. Sounds of the world returned too suddenly. Voices felt sharp. Movement felt dangerous. The city continued as if nothing had happened. Markets bustled. Bells rang. Children laughed. Life flowed around the broken individual with indifference. And yet, the damage remained. A man who had endured the rack walked differently forever. A woman who had faced the strappado could no longer lift her arms without pain. Sleep brought memories that felt as real as the chamber itself, and people noticed. Not with sympathy, but with recognition. They knew what those marks meant. They knew what those limps signified. They knew what kind of attention you had attracted. Fear followed survivors like a shadow. Neighbors avoided questions. Friends spoke cautiously. Families
Because
carried
survival
shame
did not
quietly.
mean freedom.
The
It meant
confession,
carrying the chamber
whether
with
true
you,
or false,
in your body,
lingered longer than any
in your
wound.
posture, in the way you
This
spoke,
was the system working
in the
as
way
intended.
you hesitated before answering.
The chamber
even
did not
the
exist
simplest
to punish
question.
one person alone.
The medieval world did not
It
believe
existed
in
to
rehabilitation.
discipline the imagination of
It believed
everyone
in
else.
example.
This is another reason
And
you would not
if you
survive
lived,
a single
became
day.
one.
The city that watched and said nothing. Beyond the stone walls of the chamber, life continued with unsettling calm. This is perhaps the most difficult part to accept. The medieval city did not pause for suffering. It did not gather in outrage. It did not question the machinery hidden beneath its streets and towers. The chamber was not a secret, but it was not spoken of openly either. Everyone knew it existed. No one wanted to know more. Markets opened at dawn. Merchants laid out bread, cloth, iron tools. Bells marked the hours. Priests led prayers. Children chased one another through narrow alleys, their laughter echoing off the same stone that swallowed screams at night. The city functioned because it learned how to look away. Citizens passed the keep without lifting their eyes. They avoided certain doors, certain stairways, certain corridors. They knew which guards not to question, which officials not to offend, which rumors not to repeat too loudly. Fear shaped daily behavior more effectively than any law. People learned restraint early in life. Words were chosen carefully. Opinions were shared only in trusted company, and even then cautiously. Silence became a skill, passed from parent to child like a family trade. When someone disappeared, explanations were simple. They were questioned. They are being held. They must have done something. No one asked what that something was, because asking implied doubt, and doubt was dangerous. Public punishments reinforced this understanding. A confession read aloud, a sentence announced, a body displayed briefly before being removed. These moments were ritualized, almost ceremonial. The crowd watched quietly, not with anger, not with curiosity, with relief. Relief that it was not them. The survivors of the chamber, when they returned, were reminders of boundaries. Their presence was instructional. Their injuries were lessons written in flesh. No one asked them what had happened inside, not because they did not want to know, but because knowing made one complicit. This collective silence allowed the system to endure. Torture chambers were expensive to build. They required skilled labor, materials, training, oversight. They existed only because entire societies accepted their necessity. The chamber was the unspoken agreement between ruler and ruled. Obedience in exchange for stability. Fear in exchange for order. This is something modern minds often struggle to understand. We imagine medieval people as ignorant or cruel. But many were neither. They were practical. They believed chaos was worse than suffering. They believed authority required teeth. They believed that pain inflicted on a few protected the many. And in times of uncertainty, those beliefs hardened. War made chambers busier. Plague filled cells faster. Political shifts created new enemies overnight. Religious conflict turned neighbors into suspects. The chamber adapted. New accusations emerged. New confessions were required. New examples were made. And still, the city watched and said nothing. This is another reason you would not survive. Because survival in the medieval world required acceptance of violence as background noise. It required emotional distance from the suffering of others. It required participation through silence. Modern people are trained to react, to question, to speak. In the medieval city, these instincts were liabilities. Curiosity attracted attention. Empathy invited suspicion. Outrage suggested rebellion. To last even a day, you would need to unlearn everything you believe about justice, transparency, and protection. You would need to understand that the chamber did not exist despite the city. It existed because of it. And as long as the city endured, the chamber would remain ready, waiting. Faith, guilt, and the sacred justification of pain. In the medieval world, pain was rarely seen as meaningless. It was explained, it was justified, and most dangerously, it was sanctified. Faith did not exist separately from the chamber. It flowed through it, wrapped around it, gave it language and purpose. Torture was not merely a tool of the state. It was often framed as a tool of the divine. Suffering, people were taught, revealed truth. If you were innocent, God would give you strength. If you were guilty, pain would draw the sin out of you like poison. This belief was not confined to priests or rulers. It lived in ordinary homes, whispered in prayers, taught in sermons. It shaped how people understood misfortune itself. When famine came, it was punishment. When illness spread, it was correction. When someone was taken to the chamber, it was judgment. And judgment in this worldview was never random. Inside the torture chambers, religious symbols were often present: a carved cross, a candle burning quietly in the corner. A prayer murmured before questioning began. Sometimes a priest stood nearby, not to stop the pain, but to witness it. Confession was not only legal, it was spiritual. You were not simply admitting to a crime, you were unburdening your soul. Interrogators believed this deeply. Many saw themselves not as executioners, but as instruments of purification. Pain stripped away lies. Pain forced honesty. Pain aligned the body with divine order. This belief made restraint unnecessary. If suffering served a higher purpose, then resisting it became sinful. Screams were interpreted as resistance to truth. Silence was interpreted as defiance. Compliance was the only path to redemption. For the accused, this created a terrifying internal conflict. Endure pain and prove faith, or confess and admit guilt before God. Either choice carried consequences. Those who held out too long were seen as stubborn, proud, possibly possessed. Those who confessed quickly were seen as weak, corrupt, deserving of punishment. There was no safe path. And once confession was made, it was often followed by ritual, a prayer of absolution, a blessing, a final instruction to accept suffering as penance. This blending of faith and pain ensured obedience not only through fear, but through belief. It made resistance feel wrong. It made survival feel like moral failure. Modern people raised with the idea that pain signals injustice would be utterly disoriented. In this world, pain signaled correction. You would question the chamber. And in questioning it, you would question God. That alone could bring you back inside. This is another reason you would not last a single day. because even your inner compass would betray you. Your instinct to protest suffering would be read as arrogance. Your refusal to accept punishment would be framed as evidence of guilt. Your modern sense of individual innocence would clash violently with a world that believed truth emerged only under pressure. And the city supported this logic. Parents taught children to obey not only rulers, but fate. Illness was endured quietly. Misfortune was accepted as deserved. Pain was woven into the moral fabric of life. The chamber was simply the most concentrated expression of that worldview. It stood at the intersection of law, faith, and fear. And it did not need to justify itself, because everyone already believed. The body's quiet surrender. There comes a moment, deep within prolonged suffering, when resistance no longer looks heroic. It simply looks exhausting. The medieval chamber was built to reach that moment. Not through overwhelming force, but through duration, through repetition, through the slow erosion of certainty. The body, for all its strength, is designed to protect itself. When pain becomes constant, systems begin to fail in subtle ways. Breathing changes first. It becomes shallow, irregular. Each inhale measured, cautious, as if the lungs themselves are afraid of what movement might provoke. Muscles tighten not to act, but to endure. Energy drains not through effort, but through vigilance. Sleep, when it comes, is thin and fractured. The mind drifts, then snaps awake at imagined sounds. Memories bleed into the present. The chamber follows you even when your eyes are closed. Dreams are not relief. They are repetitions. Hunger complicates everything. The body demands fuel but receives little. Weakness spreads quietly, making even simple movements feel deliberate and heavy. Standing becomes negotiation. Speaking becomes effort. Thought slows, not because the mind has accepted defeat, but because it is conserving what little remains. This is when the chamber truly succeeds, not when bones strain, not when muscles fail, but when the body begins to prioritize survival over truth. At this stage, pain no longer needs to escalate. The interrogator understands this. He changes nothing. He asks again. Your answers come more easily now, not because they are accurate, but because your mind has learned the pattern. Say something. Say anything, let it end. The body is not brave. It is practical. It will abandon ideals long before it abandons breath. Modern people like to believe they would endure, that they would hold out, that principles would protect them. But principles require energy, and energy disappears quickly in a stone room with cold air, little food, and no sense of time. This is why the medieval system rarely needed to kill. Most people surrendered long before that point. They surrendered not in dramatic screams, but in quiet agreement, in nods, in whispered confirmations, in signatures traced by trembling hands. And once surrendered, the body carried the consequences forward. Pain did not end when the chamber ended. It lingered. Nerves misfired. Muscles remembered tension. Joints locked unpredictably. A hand that once held tools now shook too much to be trusted. A back once strong bent permanently. But the greater damage was invisible. The body learned fear. It learned to flinch at footsteps, to tense at authority, to comply before being asked. This conditioning was not accidental. It was the chamber's longest-lasting effect. You would leave altered, not broken in one clear moment, but reshaped over time. This is another reason you would not survive. Because survival implies continuity. It implies that something essential remains intact. The chamber ensured that even if you lived, you would never return to who you were before. And the medieval world accepted this, as the price of order.
Those who entered willingly. Not everyone was dragged into the chambers. This is a truth that unsettles even more deeply. Some people walked there on their own. They came believing they could explain, believing their words would be enough, believing that clarity and reason would protect them. They trusted law. They trusted authority. They trusted that innocence, once demonstrated, would be recognized. The medieval world punished this trust. These individuals arrived upright, speaking calmly, answering questions clearly. They corrected misunderstandings. They offered witnesses. They assumed the process worked the way it was described. At first, the interrogators listened. They always listened. Listening did not mean agreement. It meant patience. The moment certainty appeared, suspicion followed. Confidence was interpreted as arrogance. Calmness was read as concealment. Consistency sounded rehearsed. Those who spoke too well became interesting, and interest was dangerous. Soon, clarification became contradiction. Small discrepancies were highlighted. Memory was questioned. Tone was analyzed. Silence was reinterpreted as hesitation. The conversation shifted subtly. Questions became narrower. Assumptions crept in. Explanations were no longer enough. At this point, the option of the chamber was presented not as punishment, but as assistance. Just to be sure, to clear confusion, to help you remember. Many agreed, because refusal itself implied guilt. Once inside, the illusion collapsed quickly. The presence of instruments changed the nature of truth. Words spoken earlier were read aloud, rearranged, questioned. Statements once confident now felt fragile in the cold air. The body reacted before the mind could. Fear flooded systems trained for dialogue, not survival. And when pain arrived, it arrived faster for those who had trusted the process. They were less prepared, less guarded, less resigned. Their surrender was often swift, not because they were weaker, but because they had believed in something that did not exist. This is another reason you would not survive, because modern people are trained to trust procedure, to believe that fairness exists by default, to assume that explanation is protection. In the medieval chamber, explanation was material. It was reshaped, used, turned against you. And once the process began, belief itself became irrelevant. The ones who never confessed. There were some who never spoke the words the chamber demanded. They were rare. They were remembered quietly. And they frightened the system more than any confession ever could. These individuals did not resist loudly. They did not scream defiance or curse their captors. They did not bargain. They did not invent stories. They did not offer names. They endured. At first, interrogators treated them like all the others. Procedure was followed. Pain was applied gradually. Questions were asked with practiced calm. But something was different. The answers did not come. Silence remained silence. Not stubborn silence. Not dramatic silence. A still, emptied quiet. This unsettled the chamber. The system was built on predictable human responses. Fear, pain, relief-seeking. Most bodies complied eventually. Most minds surrendered in exchange for rest. Those who did not disrupted that rhythm. Interrogators escalated carefully at first. They increased duration, not intensity. They extended sessions. They shortened rest. They introduced new instruments, one by one, never all at once. Still, no confession came. At this stage, belief systems began to fracture. Was this person innocent, possessed, protected by divine favor, or simply broken beyond reach. Each possibility was dangerous. An innocent person enduring pain threatened the moral logic of the chamber. A possessed one threatened religious authority. A person beyond reach threatened the usefulness of the entire system. So the response shifted. These prisoners were not released. They were not paraded. They were not discussed. They were removed quietly from record. Some were transferred to deeper cells where no visitors went. Some were declared dead without ceremony. Some were kept alive in isolation, their existence fading into rumor. The chamber did not need martyrs. It needed compliance. Those who could not be made to speak were anomalies to be erased. And yet, stories spread. Whispers moved through cells, through servants, through guards who spoke too much after wine. These stories carried strange reverence. A man who endured without screaming, a woman who never named anyone, a prisoner who looked past the interrogator, as if listening to something else. These stories did not inspire rebellion. They inspired unease. If someone could survive the chamber without breaking, then the chamber was not absolute. And nothing frightened authority more than doubt. So the chamber adjusted again. Pain intensified faster for new prisoners. Waiting periods shortened. Fear was applied earlier. The goal became prevention rather than correction. Break them before they realize endurance is possible. This is another reason you would not survive. Because if you resisted, you would be erased. And if you endured too well, you would be removed. There was no reward for strength, only consequences. The medieval torture chamber was not a place for heroes. It was a place designed to ensure that heroism never became useful. The long shadow that followed the chamber. Even for those who were never taken inside, the chamber shaped their lives. Its influence stretched far beyond stone walls and iron doors. It lived in habits, in silences, in the careful way people learned to move through the world. Children grew up knowing where not to go. Families learned which names not to mention. Neighbors sensed which questions carried danger. No one needed to be told. The chamber educated without teaching. People altered their behavior instinctively. They avoided gathering in groups that looked too purposeful. They lowered their voices when discussing authority. They learned to pause before speaking, to weigh each word as if it carried physical weight. Fear became environmental, like weather. Those who had survived the chamber carried its presence most clearly, not because they spoke of it, but because of how they lived afterward. They woke early, unable to sleep deeply. They flinched at sudden movement. They avoided eye contact with officials. Their posture revealed caution even when standing still. Their families noticed the change first. A husband who no longer laughed freely, a mother who startled at footsteps, a son who answered questions too quickly, too carefully. The chamber trained obedience at a distance. People learned that punishment did not require guilt. It required attention. Being noticed was enough. So they worked hard to remain invisible. This had consequences for the entire society. Innovation slowed, dissent vanished, curiosity retreated inward. The city became orderly, but brittle, stable, but fragile. On the surface, everything functioned. Underneath, everyone waited. This waiting defined medieval life more than any single act of violence. It shaped how people understood power. Authority was not something negotiated. It was something endured. Justice was not about truth. It was about alignment. Align with expectations. Align with silence. align with survival.
This is where the modern mind would falter completely. We are raised to believe that systems can be challenged, that injustice can be named, that visibility offers protection. In the medieval world, visibility invited scrutiny, and scrutiny led to the chamber. You would speak too freely, ask too openly, expect explanations that were never meant to exist. And once attention settled on you, it rarely left. The chamber did not need to touch everyone. It only needed to be believable. And it was.
The illusion of law and the final accounting. From the outside, medieval justice looked structured. There were courts, there were records, there were seals, proclamations, witnesses, and rituals that resembled order. This appearance mattered deeply. The chamber did not exist in opposition to the law. It existed inside it. Trials were held in stone halls, where banners hung and officials spoke with authority. Accusations were read aloud. Charges were framed carefully, often using language so broad it could hold nearly any interpretation. Heresy, conspiracy, treason, witchcraft, blasphemy, seduction of disorder. These were not crimes with clear edges. They were elastic concepts, expanding or contracting depending on need. And once an accusation was spoken, it took on a life of its own. The accused was no longer a person, but a problem to be resolved. Evidence mattered less than alignment. Testimony mattered less than coherence. What the court sought was not truth, but closure. A confession completed the narrative. It allowed the system to move forward. This is why torture chambers were considered legal tools rather than aberrations. They produced endings. Without confession, cases lingered. Lingering cases created doubt. Doubt weakened authority. Authority could not afford weakness. So pain became procedure. The law provided justification. Faith provided meaning. Fear provided compliance. Together they formed a closed loop. Once the chamber entered your life, there was no appeal in the modern sense. There were no rights as we understand them now. There was only escalation. Refusal meant more questioning. Resistance meant deeper suspicion. Endurance meant removal. Even acquittal was fragile. Those declared innocent after confession were still marked. They were watched, remembered, treated cautiously. Innocence did not restore trust. It only ended immediate interest. And for those who were condemned fully, punishment extended beyond death. Families lost property. Names were erased from records. Children inherited suspicion. Justice did not end with the individual. It rippled outward. This is the final reason you would not survive a single day. Because survival required acceptance of a world where law did not protect you from pain, but guided it toward you. A world where innocence was not a shield, where truth was negotiable, where silence was safer than honesty. Modern humans carry assumptions that would betray them instantly. That fairness exists. That suffering must be justified. That confession should be voluntary. That law stands between power and the body. In the medieval world, law directed power into the body. And the torture chamber was its most honest expression. Final reflection. When we look back on medieval torture chambers, we often imagine barbarism without structure, chaos without reason. But the truth is more unsettling. They were organized. They were rationalized. They were believed in. And that belief made them effective. You would not survive not because you are weak, but because you are modern. Your expectations would fail you. Your instincts would expose you. Your belief in justice would place you in danger. The medieval chamber did not break bodies alone. It broke assumptions. And once those were gone, survival was no longer a question of strength, only of compliance. The night chambers. Beneath the chambers. There were chambers that most people never knew existed, not because they were secret in the strict sense, but because they were spoken of only in lowered voices and never in daylight. These were the night chambers. They lay beneath the known rooms, below the spaces where torches burned and officials worked by schedule. The air there was heavier, unmoving, soaked with dampness that never fully dried. Stone walls pressed closer together. Ceilings lowered. Sound behaved differently. Down here, whispers did not echo. They sank. The night chambers were not always used. They did not belong to the regular rhythm of interrogation. They existed for moments when urgency replaced process, when someone was accused late, when unrest threatened, when fear needed to spread quickly. Prisoners brought here often did not know where they were. They were led down narrow stairs, blindfolded or simply too exhausted to notice turns. The temperature dropped with every step. Breath became visible even in summer. The smell changed from smoke and iron to mold and old water. Time dissolved completely. There were no bells below, no sense of hour. Only darkness broken by brief torchlight, which seemed almost intrusive, as if light itself did not belong here. Interrogations at night were different. They were quieter. No raised voices. No formal readings. No witnesses standing by. Questions were asked softly, sometimes from the shadows, sometimes from so close that breath touched skin. Pain was not applied suddenly. It crept. Cold was used first. Long exposure. Stillness enforced. Muscles stiffened. Blood slowed. The body began to ache without knowing why. Then restraint followed. Not tight enough to hurt immediately. Just enough to prevent adjustment. Just enough to remind the body that it was no longer in control of its own comfort. Sleep deprivation did the rest. The mind, already weakened, began to fold in on itself. Thoughts lost order. Memories surfaced without context. Faces blurred. Voices overlapped. Confessions given here were often incoherent. That did not matter. What mattered was that fear spread faster when people vanished overnight and returned broken, or did not return at all. The night chambers existed not to discover truth. They existed to accelerate belief. And if you were taken there, you would not understand what was happening until it was already too late. The keepers of the keys. Every chamber had instruments. Every system had laws. But none of it functioned without the keepers of the keys. They were not interrogators. They were not judges. They were not executioners. They were guards, wardens, keepers, men whose names rarely appeared in records, yet whose presence shaped every moment inside the walls. They knew the chambers better than anyone. They knew which doors swelled in winter, which locks stuck after rain, which corridors amplified sound, and which swallowed it whole. They knew where screams traveled and where they disappeared. These men lived half their lives underground. Stone dust settled into their lungs. Cold crept into their joints. The smell of iron and damp followed them home, clinging to clothes and hair no matter how often they washed. They did not speak much, not because they were cruel, but because words lost meaning in places where suffering repeated endlessly. Conversation felt unnecessary. Silence was easier. Many had families above ground, children who never asked what their fathers did, wives who stopped asking years ago. Everyone understood the boundaries. The keepers did not decide who entered the chamber, but they decided how you entered, a rough grip or a steady one, A pause on the stairs or a push forward. A moment to breathe or none at all. These small choices mattered more than mercy. Because fear thrives in anticipation. Some keepers developed habits. One always counted steps aloud as prisoners descended. Another hummed quietly, tuneless, constant. Another said nothing at all, but tapped keys against stone in slow rhythm. These behaviors were not intentional cruelty. They were coping. The keepers saw everything that followed interrogation. They carried bodies. They cleaned rooms. They unfastened restraints that had cut too deeply. They watched prisoners attempt to stand and fail. They learned how much pain a human body could carry before it simply stopped responding. Over time, many stopped seeing individuals. They saw patterns: the defiant one, the pleading one, the silent one, the broken one. This categorization made survival possible for the keepers themselves. To feel deeply in these spaces was dangerous. To empathize too much invited collapse. So they learned detachment. And that detachment shaped the chamber as much as any instrument. Because when a keeper no longer saw you as a person, only as a process moving from door to door, cruelty required no intention at all. It happened naturally, efficiently, quietly. This is another reason you would not survive. You would look for humanity in their faces. You would search for recognition. You would expect reaction. But the keepers were not trained to react. They were trained to continue. And continuation was the most frightening thing of all. The long descent into stillness. The deeper you were taken, the quieter everything became. Not the comforting quiet of rest, not the peaceful silence of night. This was a silence that pressed inward. The stairs descended slowly, uneven stone worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Each step felt colder than the last. Moisture gathered in the seams of the walls, forming dark lines that ran downward like veins. Torches burned lower here. The flame did not flicker with life. It struggled. Light bent strangely along the walls, revealing textures too close, too detailed. Chisel marks left by hands, long dead. Scratches where iron scraped stone. Faint discolorations that no one ever explained. The air grew heavier with each breath. Not thick exactly, but resistant, as if the lungs had to negotiate for space. Breathing became conscious work. Inhale slowly, hold, exhale carefully. Any sharp movement triggered pain that rippled unpredictably through the body, finding injuries you had almost forgotten existed. The keepers walked ahead of you. Keys moved against one another softly. A sound both mundane and unbearable. Each small metallic touch echoed inside your head longer than it should have. At the bottom of the stairs, there was no grand door, only a narrow passage, low ceiling, rough stone, barely wide enough for two people to walk side by side. Your shoulders brushed the walls no matter how carefully you moved. Cold transferred immediately through cloth and skin. Here, time began to stretch. Not because anything happened, but because nothing did. The keepers slowed their pace deliberately, not to torment, but because there was no reason to hurry. Everything below existed outside urgency. Whatever was meant to occur would occur when it was ready. You were placed inside a cell that felt less like a room and more like an interruption in stone. No furniture, no straw, no markings to measure size or distance. The floor was uneven, sloping slightly toward a corner where moisture pooled. The smell was not rot but age, old water, old stone, old breath. The door closed without ceremony. No final glance, no warning, no explanation. The lock turned once,
And then there was nothing. At first, the mind searched for structure. You counted breaths. You counted heartbeats. You counted imagined seconds. But without sound, without light, without reference, numbers lost meaning quickly. The body shifted its weight instinctively, trying to find comfort. None existed. Muscles tightened and released in cycles that never fully resolved. Pain migrated slowly, as if exploring new territory. Cold settled in layers, first on the skin, then beneath it, then inside. You wrapped your arms around yourself, not to stay warm, but to confirm your own shape, to remind yourself that you still occupied space. Time passed, or perhaps it did not. Thoughts grew heavier. They no longer arrived fully formed, they drifted, fragmented, overlapping. Memories surfaced without order. Faces appeared and vanished. Words lost edges. The silence began to hum. Not audibly, internally. A low, constant presence that filled the mind when nothing else could. It was not threatening. It was not comforting. It simply existed. And in that existence, something began to loosen. The need to understand. The need to anticipate. The need to resist. Stillness crept inward, not as surrender, but as exhaustion. This was the chamber before the chamber, the place where the body learned that nothing would happen quickly, that waiting itself was a tool, that uncertainty could stretch longer than pain ever could. This is where many broke without a single instrument ever touching them, not through agony, but through absence. And this is why you would not survive. Because modern minds are trained to endure events, not emptiness. To react to stimuli, not silence. To cope with pain, not with the slow erasure of reference. Here nothing asked anything of you. And that was the most unbearable demand of all.
When the body forgot the shape of time. At some point, the body stopped asking what hour it was, not because it learned the answer, but because the question no longer mattered. In the depths beneath the chambers, time did not move forward. It softened. It stretched. It lost its edges until it became something like fog, surrounding everything without direction. You could not tell whether minutes passed or entire days slipped by unnoticed. The body tried to mark time through habit. Hunger rose and fell in waves that no longer matched reality. Thirst became a dull companion rather than an urgent demand. Fatigue settled deep into the bones, not as sleepiness, but as a heaviness that made even thought feel slow. You shifted position rarely now, not because you were comfortable, but because movement cost too much. Every change in posture awakened pain that had been waiting patiently. Muscles stiffened into quiet refusal. Joints protested without sound. The body learned that stillness, even when painful, was safer than motion. Breathing became shallow and rhythmic. In, out, pause. The sound of your own breath filled the darkness. It was the only proof of continued existence. Each exhale felt like a small negotiation with the space around you. Each inhale reminded you that air, though cold and damp, still flowed. Your senses began to betray you. The mind created sounds where none existed. Footsteps, water dripping, distant voices. You turned your head instinctively, listening, only to realize that the silence remained unchanged. Sometimes you smelled things that were not there. Smoke, iron, bread. These phantom sensations arrived without warning and vanished just as suddenly. They were not hallucinations in the dramatic sense. They were fragments of memory, drifting up from a mind starved of stimulation. Thoughts slowed. Ideas no longer followed one another logically. They looped. They repeated. You found yourself thinking the same sentence again and again, not because it meant anything, but because it was familiar. Familiarity became precious. Even pain, once overwhelming, became a known quantity. It no longer shocked. It simply existed, woven into awareness like background noise. This was not adaptation. It was erosion. The body was learning to survive by becoming less responsive, less curious, less reactive. This quiet surrender was not visible from the outside. To anyone watching, you might appear calm, composed, even peaceful. But inside, something essential was thinning. The medieval system understood this phase well. This was why isolation preceded interrogation, why darkness came before instruments, why silence arrived before questions. By the time a voice finally spoke to you again, you would be altered. Not broken, not defeated, rearranged. Your sense of urgency would be gone, your resistance dulled, your desire to argue replaced by a desire to conclude. When the door eventually opened, the light would hurt your eyes. The sound of movement would feel intrusive. The presence of another human would feel overwhelming. And the question, when it came, would sound simple, almost kind. And you would answer. Not because you wanted to, not because you believed, but because part of you had already learned that waiting had no end. This is another reason you would not survive. Because modern endurance is built around deadlines, around knowing when something will be over, around the promise of conclusion. Here there was no promise, only continuation. And continuation, without meaning, without measure, without relief, is what finally wears the human mind down to something quiet enough to accept anything. The language of stone and silence. When the door opened again, it did not announce itself. There was no warning sound, no dramatic creak, no ritual knock. One moment there was only darkness, breath, and the slow collapse of thought. The next, a thin blade of torchlight cut across the stone, sharp enough to sting your eyes. Light, after darkness, is not gentle. It does not arrive as clarity. It arrives as pain. Your pupils, long accustomed to shadow, struggled to contract. The world became a smear of brightness and movement. Shapes existed, but they refused to resolve. You blinked, but blinking did nothing. Tears formed without emotion, simply as a reflex. A silhouette stepped into view. You could not see the face at first. The torch was held behind them, turning the figure into a dark outline framed by fire. Broad shoulders, a heavy cloak, slow, deliberate movements that suggested neither haste nor fear. This was not a guard. Guards moved with impatience. They shifted weight. They breathed loudly. They made noise because noise reassured them of their authority. This figure was quiet. So quiet that you became aware of how loud you were by comparison. The sound of your breathing, the faint scrape of skin against stone as you instinctively tried to adjust your position. The figure stopped a few steps away. They did not speak. Silence stretched. In medieval chambers, silence was not absence. It was a tool, a weight applied carefully, like pressure on a wound to test where it hurt most. Finally, the torch moved. Light spilled across the walls, revealing details your mind had begun to forget. Rough stone blocks, damp with age, iron rings embedded in the wall, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of use, marks on the floor that no amount of scrubbing had ever fully erased. You understood, without being told, that many had stood here before you. Not together, not remembered, but similarly. The figure lowered the torch slightly, allowing you to see their face at last.
It was ordinary. That was the most unsettling part. No scars. No theatrical cruelty. No exaggerated menace. Just a human face shaped by years of repetition. Eyes that had seen fear so often, it no longer registered as remarkable. They looked at you the way a craftsman looks at material, assessing, measuring, considering what would be required. When they spoke, their voice was calm, not loud, not threatening. "Can you understand me?" The question itself was insignificant, but it carried something deeper. It assumed you still existed as a thinking being. It invited participation. You hesitated, not because you didn't understand, but because responding felt like crossing a threshold. Your voice, when it came, sounded unfamiliar to you, dry, weak, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. Yes. The figure nodded once. That nod meant more than any speech. It meant the process could continue. It meant you were still usable. They spoke again, slowly, clearly, choosing words that required minimal effort to process. "You have been here long enough to rest." Rest. The word landed strangely. Rest was not what had happened to you. But arguing felt pointless. Correcting them felt exhausting. "You will answer some questions." A pause. "After that, you may return to quiet." The promise of quiet was not comforting. It was effective. They did not rush. They asked nothing yet. Instead, they walked around the chamber, their footsteps echoing softly. Each step reminded you how small the space truly was, how little distance existed between walls, how few places there were to retreat. They stopped behind you. You felt their presence before you saw them, the heat of the torch, the faint scent of oil and smoke, the sound of cloth shifting as they leaned closer. "You do not need to tell us everything," they said. "Only what you know." Another pause. "What you believe." This was the core of medieval interrogation. Not confession through force alone, but confession through exhaustion. By this stage, resistance was rarely dramatic. People did not scream defiance. They did not deliver speeches. They simply stopped protecting certain thoughts. The figure continued, voice even. "Think carefully before you answer. Silence will only extend your stay. Extend." The word carried weight. It reminded you of time without shape, of darkness without end, of breath counting itself in the absence of markers. Your mind searched for solid ground. What did they want? What was safe to say? What would end this fastest? These calculations felt slow, as if happening underwater. Logic still existed, but it lacked urgency. You were not trying to win. You were trying to conclude. This is where modern understanding fails. Today, interrogation is imagined as a contest of wills, a battle of stubbornness versus cruelty. In reality, medieval chambers were designed to remove the contest entirely. By the time questions were asked, the answerer was already compromised. Your body was tired, your mind was softened, your sense of identity had begun to blur. The figure asked the first real question. It was simple. It concerned names, places, associations, nothing dramatic. You answered. Not fully, not elaborately, but you answered. Each response made the next easier, not because you felt relief, but because the act of speaking reintroduced rhythm into your existence. Question, answer, pause, question, answer. Structure returned, and structure, after chaos, feels merciful. The figure listened without interruption, without reaction. They did not confirm or deny. They did not threaten or reassure. They simply recorded. At some point, you realized something terrifying. You no longer knew which answers were true and which were shaped by suggestion. Memories blurred, events lost order, Certainty thinned. When the questioning stopped, it did so quietly. "No more for now," the figure said. They stepped away. The torchlight retreated. Darkness flowed back into the chamber like water reclaiming a hollow. Before the door closed, the figure spoke one last time. "You are doing well." The door shut. Silence returned. But it was not the same silence as before. Now it was filled with words you could not unsay, thoughts you could not reclaim, a version of yourself that had already changed. This is another reason you would not survive. Because modern identity relies on continuity, on stable memory, on confidence in one's own narrative. Here, narrative dissolved. And once your story belonged to someone else, survival was no longer entirely yours to decide. When time becomes a weapon. After the door closed, there was no immediate return to darkness. Not complete darkness. The torchlight did not vanish at once. Instead, it faded slowly through the cracks around the door, thinning, like blood diluted with water. For several breaths, the chamber existed in a dim gray half-state, neither light nor night. Then even that was gone. What remained was not simply absence of light, it was the presence of time. In medieval chambers, time was not measured. It was inflicted. You tried at first to count seconds, breaths, heartbeats, any rhythm that could anchor you, but your body betrayed you almost immediately. Breaths grew uneven. Your heart refused consistency. Muscles twitched without warning, disrupting whatever internal clock you tried to build. Time began to stretch. Moments no longer followed one another cleanly. They smeared together, like ink left in rain. You could not tell whether minutes had passed or hours. Sometimes you felt certain it had been days. Other times you suspected no time at all had moved, and that the question still echoed somewhere nearby. Your body, deprived of movement, began its own slow rebellion. Numbness crept in first. It did not arrive dramatically. It arrived politely, as if asking permission. Fingers lost sensation, then toes, then larger sections of your limbs followed, until you were unsure where pain ended and absence began. This was not mercy. Numbness was dangerous. Pain at least reminded you that you existed. Numbness suggested erasure. Your thoughts drifted, uninvited, into strange territory. You remembered trivial things with painful clarity, the smell of warm bread, the sound of water poured into a cup, the feeling of fabric not soaked with damp. Memory did not follow importance. It followed comfort. You tried to recall faces, names, the reasons you were here. Those came harder. The human mind, when stripped of stimulus, does not rest. It folds inward. It begins to manufacture experience. Shadows behind your eyelids gained depth, shapes formed. They did not frighten you at first. They simply existed, floating impressions without meaning. Then they began to move. This was another known function of these chambers. Long before psychology had a name, medieval jailers understood something essential. The mind, left alone long enough, would turn against itself. You heard sounds. Not clearly, not consistently. Sometimes it was dripping water, even when no water fell. Sometimes footsteps echoed where no corridor existed. Sometimes voices whispered in languages you almost understood. You tried to tell yourself they were not real. But that logic required effort. And effort was scarce. Your body sagged further. The restraints pulled tighter as gravity did its work. Joints protested with dull, spreading aches. Your neck grew heavy. Holding your head upright became a conscious task,
one that demanded more strength than you felt you possessed. At some point, your chin dropped. The motion sent a shock through your spine. Pain flared briefly, sharp enough to wake something inside you. You inhaled sharply, drawing in cold, stale air that tasted of stone and old iron. You were awake, but not alert. This was the threshold state these places were designed to cultivate. Neither sleep nor consciousness. Neither clarity nor oblivion. In this state, promises became believable. Threats became unnecessary. You thought again of the figure, of their ordinary face, of the calm tone in which they had spoken. "You are doing well?" The phrase returned unbidden. It replayed itself over and over, smoothing the edges of your fear. The mind clung to it, the way a drowning person clings to driftwood. Doing well meant something. Doing well implied progress, purpose, an end. You began to imagine the next visit. Not with dread, but with anticipation. Questions meant interaction. Interaction meant structure. Structure meant relief from the endlessness of waiting. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths about medieval torture. People did not always fear the interrogator most. They feared the empty hours between visits. Somewhere in that stretched, formless time, your thoughts turned inward. You examined yourself as if from a distance. Who were you now? Not the person who had entered this place. That version felt theoretical, a story you had once heard but could no longer verify. You were someone reduced to sensations. Pressure, cold, fatigue, memory fragments floating without context. Identity, once solid, had become negotiable. This was not an accident. The chambers were built beneath castles, monasteries, civic halls. Above them, life continued. Bells rang, markets opened, councils debated theology and law. None of that noise reached you. Here, beneath stone and earth, the world had narrowed to a single truth: endurance. And endurance, over time, reshaped values. You no longer wanted justice, or explanation, or even freedom in the abstract sense. You wanted an end to uncertainty. You wanted predictability. You wanted the door to open again. At some point, sleep claimed you. Not rest, not recovery. Sleep arrived like collapse. Your head sagged forward. Your breathing deepened. Muscles surrendered their last tension. Dreams came, but they were thin and fragmented. You dreamed of standing in a long corridor lined with doors, each identical. No matter which you opened, it led back to the same place. You woke abruptly. Light had returned. This time it was brighter. 2 torches burned outside the chamber, their glow forcing its way through the cracks. The door opened wider than before. Cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of damp wool and human presence. More than one figure entered. Their footsteps were heavier, less careful. These were not the quiet ones. These were the ones who handled the body. They did not speak to you at first. They examined the restraints, tugged at chains, tested your responsiveness by lifting an arm and letting it fall. When it dropped uselessly, one of them grunted. "Still breathing," another said. That was all. They adjusted your position. The movement sent sharp pain lancing through joints that had grown stiff and uncooperative. You gasped involuntarily. The sound pleased them. Pain meant you were still useful. They left without ceremony. The door closed again. But now you knew something. Time was no longer passing randomly. Something was approaching. In medieval chambers, escalation followed a rhythm: rest, questioning, waiting, adjustment. Each cycle peeled away another layer of resistance, and you, already softened by silence and fatigue, were being prepared for what came next. This is why you would not last. Because survival here did not depend on strength, or courage, or conviction. It depended on how long you could remain yourself in a place designed to dissolve the very concept of self. And that dissolution had already begun.
The language of stone and flesh. The next phase did not begin with pain. That is important to understand. In medieval torture chambers, pain was never the opening act. Pain was the punctuation. The final mark at the end of a sentence already written inside your mind. What came first was reorientation. When the door opened again, it was not sudden. It creaked deliberately, announcing itself like a ritual bell. Light spilled in slowly, revealing dust suspended in the air, each particle drifting lazily as if time itself had slowed to observe you. You were no longer alone. 3 figures stood just beyond the threshold. The first you recognized, the quiet one, the voice without urgency, the one who spoke as if this were a matter of bookkeeping rather than human endurance. The second carried tools, not weapons. Not yet. Objects wrapped in cloth, their shapes concealed, their purpose suggested only by weight and the way he held them with familiarity. The third said nothing at all. He stood slightly apart, arms folded, eyes fixed on you with a distant, almost bored expression. His role was not to act, but to witness, to confirm, to remember. The chains were loosened just enough to allow movement. This too was intentional. Complete restraint led to numbness too quickly. Limited freedom allowed pain to travel, to echo, to educate. You were guided, not dragged, toward the center of the chamber. Your legs protested with sharp, unreliable jolts. Muscles screamed as they were asked to perform after long disuse. You stumbled. Hands steadied you, firm but not cruel. Cruelty was inefficient. They positioned you near a stone structure embedded in the floor. Not large, not dramatic. Just a raised surface worn smooth by centuries of use. Dark stains marked its edges, absorbed so deeply into the stone they could never be scrubbed away. You were encouraged to sit. The quiet one spoke again.
"Before we continue," he said calmly, "we must ensure understanding. Understanding of what was not specified." He circled you slowly, footsteps measured, echoing faintly off the walls. His presence was constant, but not invasive, like a thought you could not shake. "You have been given time," he continued. "Time to reflect, time to rest, time to remember what matters to you." He stopped directly in front of you. "We will now see what remains." A gesture followed. The second figure unwrapped one of the objects. It was not elaborate. No spikes. No theatrical design. Just wood and iron, shaped for leverage rather than spectacle. A device designed to speak the body's language fluently. Your breath shortened without permission. You tried to prepare, to brace yourself, to summon courage. But courage requires context. It requires belief in meaning. Here, meaning had been deliberately stripped away. The quiet one did not raise his voice. "Tell us," he said gently, "what you know." There it was. The question. Simple, open-ended, framed as an invitation rather than a demand. You searched your thoughts desperately for something useful, something acceptable, something that might satisfy them. Your silence stretched, not defiantly, confused, fragmented. The quiet one nodded, as if confirming a hypothesis. "So be it," he said. The second figure stepped forward. What followed was not sudden. The device was applied gradually. Pressure increased in increments so small they almost felt reasonable at first. The human body, always eager to negotiate, attempted to adapt. Pain did not explode, it bloomed. It spread slowly, methodically, mapping itself across nerves and joints with terrible precision. Your mind tried to isolate it, to focus on one point, but the sensation refused containment. This was another lesson these chambers taught well. Pain, when controlled, does not overwhelm. It instructs. Your breathing changed. Your jaw tightened. Sounds escaped you before you could shape them into words. The quiet one listened carefully. Not to your cries, to your rhythm. Pain was adjusted in response to breath, to tension, to movement. It was modulated, not unleashed, enough to demand attention, not enough to destroy coherence. They wanted you conscious. They wanted you present. Slowly, the quiet one said, "There is no need to rush." Time resumed its strange distortion. Moments stretched impossibly long. You became acutely aware of every sensation, every shift in pressure, every tremor in your limbs. The world narrowed again, but this time around, a single axis. Endurance. Your thoughts fragmented further. Images flickered. Memories intruded without warning. Faces appeared, then vanished. Names surfaced, then slipped away before you could grasp them. The pain did something unexpected. It simplified. Complex thoughts dissolved. Doubts vanished. Philosophies evaporated. Only one desire remained: relief. And relief, you now understood, had a gatekeeper. The quiet one. He leaned closer. "You may speak at any time," he said softly. "We will listen." This was the final cruelty of medieval torture. Choice. You were not beaten into silence. You were invited into speech. Confession became not a surrender, but a transaction. You felt words rising to your lips, not truths, not lies, something in between, something plausible enough to be accepted, something that might end this moment. The pain increased slightly. Your resolve cracked audibly inside your mind. This was not heroism undone by brutality. This was biology asserting itself. The human nervous system is not designed for prolonged, intentional suffering. It is designed to avoid it at any cost. And so you spoke. Perhaps not everything, but enough. The quiet one listened without interruption, without judgment. He nodded occasionally, making mental notes as if recording inventory. When you finished, the pressure eased, not fully, just enough to make the contrast unmistakable. Relief flooded you, disproportionate to the change. Your body sagged. Tears came without emotion attached, mere byproducts of nervous release. "You see," the quiet one said, almost kindly, "you are capable of cooperation." He stepped back. The second figure withdrew the device, wrapping it carefully once more. The third figure watched, expression unchanged, committing the moment to memory. They did not leave immediately. Instead, the quiet one lingered. "This is not punishment," he said. "This is correction. We do not seek to break you. We seek to align you. Align you with what was never stated. The chains were reapplied. Not tightly, comfortably. The door closed, darkness returned. But it was no longer empty. It was filled with anticipation. You now knew what waited beyond it. And worse, you knew that part of you would welcome the next visit, if only for the certainty it brought. This is why modern minds fail to comprehend these chambers. We imagine torture as an explosion of pain. In reality, it was a system, a slow recalibration of identity, a conversation between stone and flesh. And by the time it ended, the person who entered no longer existed. Only the answer remained. The long night, between questions. The hours that followed were not measured by light or shadow. There were no windows here, no candles left burning, no bells to mark prayer or meals. Time, as you once understood it, had been quietly taken away, folded, and locked beyond reach. This absence was deliberate. In medieval torture chambers, the space between sessions was as carefully designed as the pain itself. These hours were not meant for recovery. They were meant for erosion. You lay where they had left you. The stone beneath your body was cold in a way that felt intentional, as if it drew warmth, not just from your skin, but from something deeper. The chains allowed you to shift slightly, but never enough to find comfort. Every position brought a new ache. Every attempt at rest revealed another complaint from your body. Your mind, now unoccupied by immediate pain, turned inward. And this was when the real work began. At first, thoughts came in fragments. Disconnected memories surfaced without warning. A voice you once knew, a smell from a place long gone, the feeling of warmth from a fire that no longer existed. Then the memories sharpened. You began to replay the session. Not the pain, the words. The moment when relief followed speech. That contrast lingered. Your body remembered it more clearly than the suffering itself. This, too, was understood by those who built these chambers. Pain alone teaches nothing, but pain paired with relief creates association. It builds pathways. It rewires instinct. You began to wonder, uninvited, what else you might say next time, what details you had held back, what omissions might still carry value. You caught yourself doing this and felt a surge of shame. But shame in this place had no function. It did not protect you. It did not strengthen you. It only drained energy. And energy was already scarce. Sleep came in brief, shallow waves. You drifted, then jolted awake, muscles twitching, heart racing, unsure if you had heard footsteps or imagined them. Every sound became suspicious. Every silence felt like a pause before interruption. Eventually, you lost the ability to tell whether you were awake or dreaming. In one vision, the chamber expanded into a vast hall filled with murmuring voices, faces blurred together, all watching, all waiting. In another, you were alone in a field under a pale sky, ash drifting down like snow, coating everything in gray. These images were not random. They were your mind searching for escape routes that no longer existed. At some point, hunger arrived. Not sharply, not urgently, just a dull awareness that something essential was missing. Water followed later. A dryness that clung to your tongue and throat, making swallowing uncomfortable even when there was nothing to swallow. You began to understand something important. No one needed to threaten you anymore. Your body was now doing the work for them. Footsteps returned without warning, not hurried, not cautious. They approached with the same measured pace as before, as if the chamber existed outside of urgency. The door opened. Light entered again, softer this time, filtered through cloth or smoke. It revealed the same three figures. They had not changed. This, too, was unsettling. The quiet one spoke first. "Did you rest?" he asked. The question was absurd, and yet, part of you wanted to answer honestly. He stepped closer, observing you with the practiced eye of someone assessing a tool rather than a person. "Time clarifies," he continued. "It strips away the unnecessary." The second figure brought water. A small cup, wooden, unadorned. It was held just out of reach. "Drink," the quiet one said, "when you are ready." Ready for what was not said. You nodded faintly. The cup was brought closer. You drank greedily, the water cool and shockingly pleasant. Relief spread through your body far faster than it should have.
This, you realized dimly, was another lesson. Relief did not require comfort. It only required contrast. They waited while you drank. No pressure was applied, no questions were asked. Then the cup was removed. The quiet one resumed his position in front of you. Yesterday, he said, you spoke. Not you confessed. Not you admitted. Just you spoke. And today, he continued, we will speak again. The chains were adjusted, not tightened, repositioned. You were guided to stand. Your legs protested, but held. You were led not to the stone platform from before, but to another area of the chamber, one you had not yet seen clearly. Against the far wall stood a series of objects arranged with deliberate symmetry. Ropes, wooden frames, iron fittings, devices whose purpose was not immediately obvious. They were displayed openly. There was no attempt to conceal them. Fear thrives on imagination. Control thrives on clarity. The quiet one gestured toward them. These, he said calmly, are not instruments of cruelty. They are instruments of truth. He paused, allowing the statement to settle. Each is designed to ask a question the mind alone cannot answer. You swallowed. He turned back to you. But before we proceed, he added, we must ensure alignment. He nodded to the third figure. For the first time, the silent observer moved. He stepped forward and produced a parchment. A list. Names, dates, locations written in careful script. He began to read. Each line corresponded to something you recognized. A place you had been, a person you had known, an event you remembered differently. Some details were wrong, some were disturbingly accurate. This was not interrogation. This was demonstration. We know enough, the quiet one said gently, as if reassuring you. But knowledge without confirmation is incomplete. He leaned closer. Help us complete it. The offer was clear. Speak freely, and the chamber remains a place of words. Resist, and it becomes a place of demonstration. You felt the weight of exhaustion press down on you. Your thoughts moved slower now. Simpler. Complex plans dissolved before they could form. You wanted this to end. You wanted certainty. And certainty, you now understood, lived only in cooperation. This is where modern imagination fails again. We imagine strength as defiance. But in this place, defiance had no audience, no reward, no meaning. The system did not break you by force. It waited until you redefined survival itself. And when you finally spoke again, your voice was quieter, not weaker, just narrower. The quiet one listened. He always listened. And as you spoke, you felt something unsettling. Not fear, not pain, but a strange sense of order returning. This was the most dangerous moment of all, because the chamber was no longer only around you. It was inside you. The chamber learns your name. At some point, they began to use your name, not loudly, not ceremonially, just quietly, as if it had always belonged to the room. Hearing it spoken here felt different than hearing it anywhere else. It no longer connected you to a past life, to family, to memory. It functioned instead as a label, a way to reference a thing already present. Names in the medieval mind carried weight. To name something was to place it within order. To strip a name away was to erase it. To repeat a name again and again was to bind the person to the system that spoke it. The quiet one used your name sparingly. He did not ask questions immediately. He allowed silence to return. Longer this time. Heavier.
The chamber seemed to listen along with him. The stone walls absorbed sound and gave nothing back. You noticed something else. The instruments along the wall had been rearranged, not dramatically, not to intimidate, simply adjusted. One frame was closer now, a rope slightly higher. An iron fitting rotated a few degrees, as if someone had considered it carefully and decided this alignment was better. This was not preparation for pain. It was preparation for inevitability. The quiet one folded his hands. "Before we continue," he said, "you should understand where you are." He did not mean the chamber. He meant the system. "These rooms exist," he continued, "not because men are cruel, but because men fear disorder." He walked slowly, each step deliberate, tracing a path you would soon be forced to follow. "When kingdoms fracture," he said, "when faith is questioned, when loyalty becomes uncertain, truth becomes dangerous." He stopped in front of you. "And dangerous things must be contained." This was not a threat. It was a lesson. "You believe," he said gently, "that what happens here is about punishment." He shook his head almost imperceptibly. "It is about preservation." He gestured toward the parchment again. "These names," he said, "these events, they threaten coherence." You realized then that your individual suffering was irrelevant. You were not being examined as a person. You were being examined as a potential disruption. In medieval systems, order mattered more than mercy. Stability mattered more than accuracy. A clean narrative was preferable to a complex truth. And you were complex. Too complex. The second figure approached and adjusted your restraints. Again, not painfully. Just enough to ensure attentiveness. Discomfort without escalation. The quiet one resumed speaking. "Words," he said, "are the least invasive method we possess." He paused. "But they are also the least reliable." He turned, selecting an object from the wall. Not a blade, not a spike, a wooden frame with leather bindings. "This," he said, "exists to remove doubt." Your heart rate increased, but your body did not react the way you expected. There was no surge of panic, no desperate urge to resist, only heaviness. Fatigue had dulled urgency. Repetition had dulled fear. You were guided toward the frame. The stone beneath your feet felt uneven, textured by centuries of use. Others had stood here, many others. Their presence lingered in ways you could not see. As the bindings were applied carefully, methodically, you noticed how precise the movements were. No rush, no cruelty. This was craftsmanship. The quiet one stepped back. "Now," he said, "we will continue." The questions that followed were not accusations. They were clarifications. He asked you to recount events you had already described, but in slightly different ways. To reorder timelines. To explain motivations. Each answer was met with a nod, sometimes with a correction, sometimes with silence. Then, when a contradiction appeared, the frame was adjusted. Not violently, just enough to strain muscles already exhausted. Your body responded immediately, not with screams, with compliance. You corrected yourself. The pressure eased. This pattern repeated. Again and again.
Slowly, imperceptibly, your version of events began to change. Not because you wanted to lie, but because truth, as you remembered it, required energy to defend. And energy was something you no longer had. You began to favor answers that produced calm. You noticed which words led to pauses instead of adjustments, which phrasing brought stillness instead of strain. This was learning. This was conditioning. And it worked because it did not feel like coercion. It felt like cooperation. At one point, the quiet one stopped the session. "That will be enough for now," he said. You were released and guided back to the floor. Water was given. A piece of bread, dry and tasteless but grounding. As you ate, he watched. "You are doing well," he said. The praise landed softly. And that was when you realized the most dangerous truth of all. You were no longer measuring survival by escape. You were measuring it by approval. This is why you would not last a day here. Because modern endurance relies on autonomy, on the belief that suffering is temporary and self-directed. Here, survival was redefined. It meant alignment. And once alignment became the goal, the chamber no longer needed to escalate. It simply waited for you to become predictable. And predictability in this place was the final surrender.
The day the chamber became familiar, there came a moment when you recognized the sound of the door before it opened. Not consciously at first. Your body reacted before your mind did. Muscles tightened slightly. Breathing adjusted. The rhythm you had learned returned without instruction. This recognition unsettled you more than the pain ever had. Familiarity meant adaptation. Adaptation meant survival. And survival here carried a price. The door opened as it always did. The same measured pace, the same restraint, the same absence of urgency. They entered without ceremony. The quiet one took his place across from you. The others remained where they always stood, positioned not for efficiency, but for balance. The room felt arranged, as if every human presence had a role beyond function. No one spoke at first. Silence stretched, not awkwardly, but intentionally. It gave you time to notice details you had ignored before. The way moisture clung to the stone, the faint smell of old iron and damp cloth, the subtle temperature difference between the floor and the air above it. Your senses had sharpened. This was another unintended consequence of prolonged exposure. With nothing else to engage, the mind learned to examine everything. The quiet one finally spoke. "Do you know why we return at the same hour?" he asked. You hesitated. "I don't know," you said. He nodded, as if pleased. "Consistency," he said, "creates expectation. Expectation creates compliance." He walked slowly now, tracing the perimeter of the chamber, his footsteps echoing faintly. "When you know when we will arrive," he continued, "your mind prepares itself. It rehearses. It anticipates." He stopped behind you. This removes resistance before it forms. You swallowed. The restraint was adjusted again, subtly, enough to remind you that stillness was preferred. "Today," he said, "we will not ask about events." He returned to your line of sight. "We will ask about meaning." This was new. Events could be recited, names listed, dates rearranged, meaning required interpretation. He gestured toward the parchment. "Why?" he asked. "Did you choose to be where you were?" The question was deceptively simple. You began to answer, explaining circumstances, chance, necessity. Each sentence felt heavier than the last, not because it was wrong, but because it required justification. He listened without interruption. When you finished, he tilted his head slightly. "That is a sequence," he said, "not a reason." You tried again. This time the words came slower. You searched for intention where there may have been none. You shaped your explanation to sound coherent. The frame was adjusted slightly. Pressure increased, but only enough to draw your attention inward. You corrected yourself. Pressure eased. The lesson repeated. Meaning was not something you possessed. It was something extracted, Over time, you noticed something else. The questions were narrowing, they no longer explored alternatives. They guided you toward a particular interpretation, a version of events that fit neatly within a larger narrative. You began to sense what answers were expected, not because they told you, but because deviation carried consequence. And consequence here was never dramatic, never immediate. It was cumulative. Each correction drained a little more energy. Each hesitation cost a little more comfort. Each silence felt heavier than the last. At some point, the quiet one stopped again. "You are learning," he said. This time the words did not frighten you. They reassured you. That realization landed quietly, like a stone sinking into deep water. After the session, you were returned to the floor as usual. Water was given, bread again, the same ritual. You ate without thinking. Your hands moved automatically. Your jaw worked mechanically. Hunger no longer announced itself loudly. It existed as background necessity. When the door closed again, you did not watch it.
You lay back and stared at the ceiling, tracing invisible patterns in the stone. Your thoughts drifted, not toward escape, toward completion. You wondered how many more sessions remained, not how to avoid them, but how many until this was finished. This was the final shift. The chamber had become a process rather than a threat. You had begun to participate. This is where modern endurance collapses completely. We believe suffering must be resisted to be endured. That strength lies in opposition. But here, survival was achieved through alignment, through understanding the rules of the environment and adjusting yourself accordingly. The medieval system did not demand heroism. It demanded adaptation. And adaptation, when prolonged, reshapes identity. By the time you realized that the chamber felt almost familiar, it was already too late. You no longer measured time by days. You measured it by questions, and questions here never truly ended.
When silence became a language. There was a day when no questions were asked at all. The door opened. They entered. They took their places. And then nothing happened. At first, you waited. Your body prepared for what had always followed. Muscles tensed slightly. Breathing adjusted. The familiar internal counting began, measuring seconds without knowing why. But the quiet one did not speak. He simply sat. The others remained still, their presence forming a shape in the room, an unspoken geometry that enclosed you without contact. The chamber felt fuller than usual, not with action but with attention. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. Time had long ago stopped behaving predictably. The silence grew thick, not empty. It pressed gently against your thoughts, leaving nowhere to hide. Without questions to answer, your mind searched for them on its own. You began to replay past sessions again, not out of fear, but habit. You remembered phrases you had used, corrections you had made, the subtle adjustments that had brought relief. You evaluated them, unconsciously, as if preparing for an exam that had not yet been announced. This was not anxiety. It was readiness. At some point, you realized something unsettling. You missed the questions. They had become structure, a framework that gave shape to otherwise formless time. Without them, the chamber felt unmoored, drifting. The quiet one watched you closely. He noticed the moment when your eyes shifted, when your posture changed almost imperceptibly. He noticed when your breathing slowed too much, when your attention began to wander inward. He waited. Finally, he spoke. "Do you know why we sometimes say nothing?" he asked. Your voice felt distant when you replied. "No," he nodded. "Because silence reveals alignment more clearly than speech. He stood and began to pace again, his footsteps slow and deliberate. "When we ask questions," he said, "you focus on answering. When we remain silent, you focus on yourself." He stopped directly in front of you. "Tell me," he said softly, "what do you think we want to hear?" The question struck deeper than any instrument. You hesitated. There was no immediate discomfort, no adjustment of restraints, just the weight of expectation. "I don't know," you said finally. The quiet one smiled faintly. "That answer," he said, "is becoming less true." He gestured, and the second figure approached with water. This time the cup was placed directly in your hands. No delay, no condition. You drank slowly, almost reverently. The water tasted the same as always, but the gesture changed its meaning. "Control," the quiet one said, "is not the removal of choice." He paused. "It is the narrowing of acceptable options." He took the empty cup from you and stepped back. "You now understand the boundaries," he continued. "You move within them, without instruction." This was not accusation. It was observation. You realized then that your silence had spoken clearly enough. You had internalized the chamber, its rhythms, its expectations, its consequences. When the quiet one finally left that day, the door closed more softly than usual, or perhaps your ears had simply learned to hear less. You lay back again, staring into the dimness. Your thoughts no longer raced. They drifted. You considered how little effort it now took to remain still, how the pain that once dominated your awareness had receded into something manageable, almost background. This was not because the chamber had grown gentler. It was because you had grown smaller inside it. This is another reason you would not survive here. Modern identity is built on expression, on reaction, on asserting the self against environment. Here the self was not attacked. It was slowly replaced by routine, by expectation, by the quiet comfort of predictability. You were no longer resisting the chamber. You were participating in it, and participation once learned is far harder to unlearn than obedience. The moment the chamber no longer needed to ask. There was a session when the quiet one did not bring parchment, no lists, no names, no timelines to correct. He entered the chamber empty-handed, and that absence felt heavier than any instrument. You noticed it immediately. Your body responded before your thoughts could catch up. A subtle tightening in the chest, a slight lift of attention, an awareness that something fundamental had shifted. The quiet one stood where he always stood. But this time, he did not look at you right away. He looked at the room, at the stone, at the walls, at the instruments resting in silence along the far side. He let his gaze linger, as if acknowledging the chamber itself as a participant in what was about to happen. Then he turned to you. "You have learned," he said. It was not praise. It was not judgment. It was a statement of fact. "You no longer wait for instruction," he continued. "You no longer resist anticipation. You prepare yourself without being told." He stepped closer. This is the point at which questions become unnecessary. Your throat felt dry, though you had been given water earlier. The sensation was not physical. It was something deeper, a reflexive response to uncertainty, returning after a long absence. He circled you slowly. "In earlier days," he said, "we would now increase pressure." He stopped behind you. But pressure is no longer required. You realized then that the chamber had not become easier. It had become efficient. "Tell me," he said quietly, "what do you think happens next?" The question hung in the air. You searched yourself for an answer, and what you found disturbed you more than fear ever had. You did not think in terms of escape. You did not think in terms of resistance. You thought in terms of sequence. You imagined the next adjustment, the next clarification, the next acceptable version of events. And in that realization, something inside you shifted again. I don't know, you said, but the words lacked conviction. The quiet one nodded. That is acceptable, he said, because the important part is not the answer. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. It is that you tried to anticipate it. He stepped away and gestured to the others. They did not approach you. They began to dismantle part of the chamber instead. An instrument was removed from the wall. A frame was loosened and carried away. A rope was coiled carefully and set aside. This should have relieved you. Instead, it created unease. The chamber was changing, not to release you, but because it no longer needed everything it once did. This place, the quiet one said, exists to transform uncertainty into certainty. He turned back to you. And you have become certain. You were unbound slowly, not abruptly, not dramatically. The restraints loosened as if concluding a routine task rather than ending a punishment. You were helped to sit. Your legs trembled not from weakness alone, but from the unfamiliar sensation of movement without resistance. Water was given. Bread again. The ritual completed itself. You will be moved, the quiet one said. Not freed, not released, moved. To another space, he continued, where your presence will no longer be disruptive. You understood then. This was not an ending. It was a transition. The chamber had done its work. Not by extracting every secret. Not by breaking you into confession. But by reshaping how you understood yourself. You were no longer someone who opposed the system. You were someone who functioned within it. As you were led away, the chamber faded behind you, not with relief, with absence, and that absence felt strangely hollow. This is the final truth of these places. They did not exist to produce screams. They existed to produce silence, not the silence of death, but the silence of alignment. This is why a modern person would not survive here, not because the pain was unbearable,
Not because the instruments were cruel beyond imagination, but because survival required surrendering something modern life teaches you to guard above all else. Your internal reference point, your sense of self as separate from the system around you. Here, endurance meant becoming compatible, and compatibility came at the cost of identity. The chamber did not need to destroy you. It only needed to teach you how to remain.
Why you would not last a day. Long after the chamber fell silent, long after the stone cooled and the iron rusted, what remained was not pain. It was memory. Not the sharp memory of suffering, but the deeper one. The memory of how easily the human mind adapts when there is no alternative. How quickly meaning rearranges itself when survival depends on agreement rather than truth. Medieval torture chambers were not built to extract screams. They were built to reshape people. They existed in a world where there were no guarantees, no rights, no appeals, no expectation that suffering should make sense or end quickly. A world where authority was absolute, faith was enforced, and the individual mattered only insofar as they fit the story being told. You would not survive there because you expect context. You expect explanation. You expect an ending. You expect pain to be temporary and injustice to be corrected. In those chambers, pain was routine. Silence was instruction. and time did not promise relief. Modern strength is built on choice. Medieval endurance was built on submission to systems that did not care whether you agreed, only whether you complied. The chamber did not need to break your body. It only needed to wait. And eventually, you would stop resisting, not because you were weak, but because you were human. That is the quiet truth these places leave behind. Not that they were cruel beyond imagination, but that they worked. And that is why, even for one single day, you would not last. Sleep now, knowing that this world is gone, and be grateful that it is. The stones remember, but you do not have to. End